Today, our focus is on legacies and futures, and the subtitle is Promises of Process-Relational Philosophy for a Transformed World. Our speakers will be in this order: Philip Clayton, Andrew Schwarz, and Thandeka. I'm going to introduce all three here at the beginning, and then we will turn it over to them. Our procedure will be after they've spoken, rather than have them talk among themselves, we're going to open it up to all of you. And then you can ask questions, make comments, engage in dialogue with the panel. And then later, we will invite the panelists to talk with one another and to continue that dialogue with one another. So that is the map for today. Now, Phil Clayton will offer a big picture of the process movement, especially the last 60 years. He's going to be asking what was the process-relational movement in the past, and what might it become in the future. He'll reflect on the movement since 1975 and before, going back to 1960 even. His reflections will be a movement theoretical analysis, which is what he calls it, fascinating term, which promises to be generative for the very future toward which he points. Dr. Clayton is well positioned to analyze this history and vision. He served for over 20 years as the Ingraham Chair at Claremont School of Theology, succeeding John Cobb and Marjorie Sue Hockey. He's the author or editor of 26 books with major foci in process philosophy, science and values, environmental ethics, and ecological socialism. You see this huge range of his work, all of which he does with expertise. Philip currently serves as president of the Institute for Ecological Civilization, EcoCiv. And among his books, just to give a sense of the span, are Religion and Science, God and Gravity, In Whom We Live and Move and Have Our Being, and The New Possible, Visions of Our World Beyond Crisis. Philip is a major leader in this thought world and in the action world, so we're really glad to have Philip today. Our second speaker will be Andrew Schwarz, who will address John Cobb's legacy in particular, with a focus on, and I give you his title, A Process Vision for Confronting Existential Threats. Dr. Schwarz is an American philosopher and activist. He currently serves as executive director of the Center for Process Studies and is co-founder and vice president of the Institute for Ecological of Process Studies and Comparative Philosophy at Claremont School of Theology. His research and teaching cover a wide range of topics, such as environmental philosophy, philosophy of religion, Asian and comparative philosophies, metaphysics, economic philosophy, philosophy of mind, philosophy of education, and more. So here is a man, as is Philip, a man of many interests and talents and broad areas of expertise. His current work mainly focuses on, on the role of big ideas in bringing about systems change for the long-term well-being of people and the planet. I want to say that again because this is important to the work of this entire panel today. The role of big ideas in bringing about systems change for the long-term well-being of people and the planet. Representing this emphasis, the ecological emphasis, is the book that he co-authored with Philip Clayton, What is Ecological Civilization?, which is a very important defining book for this movement. Now, Thandeka will focus her reflections on the process success story and the elephant in the room. Thandeka is a Unitarian Universalist theologian, minister, and congregational consultant, founder and president of Love Beyond Belief, and creator and co-director of the Universal Connections, a small group. Thandeka has spent more than 2 decades studying the brain sciences of emotions, affective neuroscience. As a result, she founded Contemporary Affect Theology, which she abbreviates as CAT, C-A-T, and and this whole movement I'm going to say it a different way, focuses on spiritual experiences rather than religious beliefs, and reveals that when you dive into religious experiences, you come to something that is more or less universal, shared by human beings across the planet, human beings of many faiths and no faiths. This kind of focus on spiritual experience also yields a deep regard for the dignity of all life, human and more than human. Thandeka has drawn upon her analytic work also to uncover roots of anti-Semitism and racism, and she's done a great deal of consulting work in those areas. Her more recent book on that subject is Love Beyond Belief, fascinating work, and her earlier work was called Learning to Be White, which created quite a revolution in thinking about race. So thank you, all three. You are amazing people, and we're so lucky to have you today. Philip, let's turn it over to you.
All right. Well, I do want to ask the question, what was the process-relational movement in the past, and what might it become in the future? So as Mary Elizabeth already said, this is a movement theoretical analysis. Why a movement theoretical analysis? Why would that seem like an important thing to do? I think that many of the speakers are going to turn to the resources of process philosophy or process theology or other concepts such as ecological civilization. So I thought it might be interesting to reflect on what have we been as a movement since 1975, or even back to the founding of CST and John's earlier books. And against that backdrop, what happens in the transition period of a movement? And finally, what might we become beginning in 2025 and extending for the next 50 years? So let's think of the 4 broad phases of the process-relational movement. I mentioned the pre-movement years, founding of CST, John's early books, what we've been as a movement since 1975, roughly, the founding of the Center for Process Studies, actually it's 73, at the time of transition, and then the process-relational movement that is to come. So let's think a little bit about that first period, the pre-movement years, back to the founding of CST. And John's early books. Really, I wouldn't class this as a movement. We were an intellectual school. So John's early books were picking up on liberal theology, engaging death of God theology, beginning to bring the resources of process thought from Whitehead mediated through Charles Hartshorne to the discussions. But in his discussion, though he represented a position as a process theologian, people didn't think of him as a movement. So I would speak, for example, with my doctoral advisor, Wolfhard Pannenberg, who was in Claremont in 1967 and said it was interesting to have these discussions. John Cobb and I agreed on points A, B, and C. We disagreed on these other points. So it was a sort of an intellectual back and forth. Like most liberal theologians, they were working within the context of the church and the church's dialogue with the secular world, with science, and with other religions, but not describing it as a process of movements and other movements. So it's really with the founding of the Center for Process Studies that we began to be seen as a movement. And what I want to say is that we were punching above our weight. It was a tiny financial investment behind the work of CPS compared to far less effective, momentous movements in American religious thoughts. What made us successful in that process? And I'd like to suggest 7 points. Very famous philosophers, theologians, and scientists were involved. I could give the list of the Nobel type laureates who were a part of John Cobb's world. What was really interesting is that he did his research with a distinctive feature as process relational thought, a distinctive lineage that he had worked on and scholarship, but with a completely open door policy. In fact, aggressively open door policy to engage, if we can say anything about John Cobb as aggressive, to engage with other traditions as well. I think John's warmth and openness were huge in the growth of the movement of process relational thought. Combined with this is a match made in heaven of David Griffin's analytic rigor. I sometimes thought as John is a kind of evangelist for process thought. Everybody would want to welcome him in and to hear his message. And David Griffin, like the engineer of process thought. And he approached movement building the way he approached writing his more analytic pieces, the way he approached organizing conferences, and the way he approached bringing scholars together. And many of you on this call remember David's contribution. That the sense that both of them said nothing separates us, virtually nothing separates us in the views that we hold, and yet had massively different complementary approaches was huge, I think, for the growth of the movement. Clear, powerful, accessible publications, and this balance of academic and popular publications. It almost seemed like John, whether intentionally or not, would do a popular book for church members, and the next year a heavy analytic book, and then another popular book. He would offer something in nascent form at a conference in a paper, and then David would turn it into an analytic argument of 12 points in the following publication. I think deep religious pluralism is the paradigm case of that. Throughout, for John in particular, the connection with the liberal progressive church. He could formulate virtually everything he did as a scholar in terms that a church person could understand. I think that's huge for the success of the movement. Embracing multiple religious traditions was crucial. This dialogue was not just among conservative Christians. It wasn't just among Christians. It was far beyond that. I think the dialogues that John was involved in with Buddhists in the 1960s and into the 70s was crucial as well. And finally, the process relational movement contributed substantially to issues and concerns that people cared about. It's what they were doing seemed important, whether you were sitting at the UCC annual meeting and hearing John give the keynote, whether it was the question of taking on capitalism and American imperialism, whether it was opening up a dialogue between Buddhists and Christians, whether it was environmental crisis, economic injustice. Each one of these seemed important to people. Now, my last 2 points are to look at this next phase, what I call the time of transition. And I want to remind you, I hope some of you already know about Bill Bridges, who did 3 books about transitions making sense of life changes, ranked as one of the 20 most influential organization development books of all time, Managing Transitions, Making the Most of Change, and then The Way of Transition, Embracing Life's Most Difficult Moments, written after his wife died at a tragic young age, and he was working his way through that. And I want to share with you what Bridges says, and I'll give you the URL at the end. He used the phrase wilderness and spoke of his major examples of the people of Israel leaving Egypt, crossing the Red Sea in the time of wilderness, and then entering the Promised Land. And he took wilderness as a metaphor. He called it the neutral zone, Look at this and see how much you think this matches where we are today. A period of uncertainty and disorientation that occurs between the ending of an old phase and the beginning of a new one, where the old ways are dissolving and new ones haven't yet solidified, essentially representing a time of transition, there we are, where one is navigating uncharted territory, much like being in the wilderness. And here are the three key points about wilderness in Bill Bridges' model. Number one, symbolic meaning. It's not a literal place. It's a metaphor for the state of being in between, where we feel lost, unsure, and potentially anxious. It's an opportunity for growth. It's a time for reflection, personal growth, and growth as a, or rebirth and growth as a movement. It was, after all, the people of Israel, right? And becoming independent and moving to their promised land. And finally, the importance of navigation, a great phrase. Transitioning through this phase where we are now requires active engagement and conscious decision-making to move towards a new beginning. And finally, he emphasizes the dangers of the neutral zone because of the negative outcomes that are possible. Disintegration of the former forms could be terminal, a fatal entropy, I love that phrase, that leads nowhere. In such a case, the organization would slowly come apart. That's a worry for our movement. The danger that in its weakened state, the organization or movement, in our case, will be conquered from outside. So it could be defeated or acquired by a competitor. Or the disintegration of the period under John, with John as our mentor and saint and icon, will release destructive inner forces that when John was around, they were kept in check. In this case, we're engulfed by old unresolved conflicts or overcome by old inherent weaknesses. And so here in closing for this middle thing, the challenge of this phase of transition is how to handle matters in such a way that the destruction of the old system does not damage the elements from which the new system will be built. That one is really worth some reflection. And Bridges' proposed solution is beginning to create among the leaders of the movement the basis for a new identity and a new culture. That means giving them a new sense of mission. And so I close with 4 suggestions to retain a core message that is distinctive, aligned with our past, and compelling. I have lots to say about each one of those terms, but given that we're at time, I'll just let that one sit for now. Number 2, to show people that the process-relational movement has unique content that, at the same time, is helpful to them in the issues that are of the greatest existential urgency to them. Number 3, to reach out to allied positions and groups, as John did so well, and to avoid territorial battles. And finally, embrace novelty and adventure to walk our talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was so insightful. And I suggested that you keep your PowerPoint handy so we can come back and discuss it. Thank you. Andrew Schwarz.
Yes. Hello, everybody. I don't even know where to begin. I appreciate Philip's exploring a little bit of the history. That actually is what came to my mind as well. Thinking about where do we go from here, by thinking of where have we been already. And something that in preparation for all these reflections on John and his legacy and his life and his memorial service that's coming up here in another few weeks. I've been doing some reading and looking into things that John has written about his own life and summarizing things, and I really liked this section of something he wrote called his autobiography that you can actually find on Religion Online. And he picking up sort of in the middle, there's a really important turn in his life where he says, and I quote, "An important change in my life orientation occurred in 1969, largely under pressure from one of my sons, Cliff, I was awakened to the environmental crisis. I wrote articles and books, lectured, and organized conferences. The Alternatives to Catastrophe Conference in 1972 brought Herman Daly and Paolo Soleri to Claremont. They've been important friends for me ever since. He then goes on and says, the awareness of the crisis affected me in several ways. It made me more of an activist. It broke me out of my own disciplinary captivity. I changed my working definition of theology from an academic discipline, concerned with its own disciplinary conversations, to intentional Christian thinking about important questions. I discovered with Whitehead's thought had important implications for action. Meanwhile, the Divinity School of Chicago, he says, had ceased to be a distinctive school of thought. The tradition that had been so important to me now had no institutional grounding to support. I wondered if I was called to respond. So he says, Lewis Ford spent a sabbatical year in Claremont in the late 1960s, and we shared our concerns. In 1970, we launched a journal, Process Studies, so that work in process thought could be published. Ford was editor, and we handled business matters in Claremont. Ford is especially interested in technical philosophical studies that were philosophical journals, other philosophical journals would not want. And I was especially interested, he said, in applications of Whitehead's thought. I dreamed of doing something more, especially in order to test and develop the relevance of process thought across a wide spectrum of fields. And he talks about being invited to Emory and how he basically was then able to establish the Center for Process Studies in Claremont, joined by David Griffin in 1973. And he later goes on, Mary Elizabeth, to name you and to name Catherine Keller as two of his most brilliant, students and women that he's ever known. So you should definitely look it up. And but so I read something like that, and I think this is where John Cobb's coming from. This is the creation of the Center for Process Studies that I now have the privilege to lead. And I'm looking at this legacy, and I'm thinking, so where do we go from here? And there's so many possibilities. And as Philip explained, the sort of balance interplay between David and John in those years of the sort of outward looking activist, accessible stuff and that real rigid, rigorous, academic work that was being done. And it was never one or the other. It was always this interplay of them both. And I'd like to think that's because they recognize um, that these are two sides of the same coin, right? Um, that real serious creative thinking and conversations need to be coupled with real world issues and problems and actions. So even in John's own words, saying he was interested in the implications of Whitehead's thought for action. Um, so I've been thinking about, well, what does that mean for the future of the process movement? What does that mean for the future of the Center for Process Studies? And I just can't escape the feeling that in the spirit of John Cobb, and moving forward in that general trajectory that we've already been put on, that we need to just boldly address urgent issues and existential threats. I worry that it would be too easy for us to actually I guess take steps backwards in the wrong direction where Cobb and Griffin and others had intentionally moved us away from. For example, um, not getting tied up in narrow disciplinary discourses for their own sake, and ignoring real world issues. Like that would be a problem. And I feel like that would undermine the purpose of the Center for Process Studies. Treating process thought as a discipline unto itself, right? Where I think that it's one of those things where like the Process Studies Journal was created for conversations that maybe weren't welcome in other places. But if we're not careful, then it could sort of be an insular conversation where we're just talking to ourselves about ourselves. Um, and again, losing our relevance to the things that matter most. Um, so what would it look like for us to be relevant, to engage real world issues but also to do so from our own unique perspective and strength. So I thought, okay, well, what are some of the global challenges? So I asked ChatGPT, what are the major urgent threats of today? And actually, I was happy to see that this is the obvious things that we already all know, right? Climate change and environmental degradation, which leads to a whole host of other things like food and water scarcity, major weather events, mass extinction, and biodiversity loss. Like literally the threat of against the ability for our planet to sustain life. Um, we have to engage in that. Um, we just it's just an issue that our community cannot ignore. And I think that we have a unique ability to do so, engaging the vision of ecological civilization, the work that EcoCiv is doing, the work Pandopopulous is doing, the work that so many of us have been doing, and so many of you. So I just want to make sure that we keep that in the forefront of our minds as something that's important that we continue to address. Um, but then there's this civilizational part of ecological civilization that's not simply just about, let's go hug some trees and care about the furry creatures, but ignore the other sort of social issues. It's the interplay of the social and environmental, right? So then I say, okay, well, ChatGPT tells me that number two major existential threats is global inequality and economic injustice. Well, that's a big one. And of course, John had put a whole lot of time and energy into thinking about rethinking economic systems and structures, alternatives to capitalism, alternatives to sort of just money theory, and monetary theory, and rethinking banking, and privatization and ownership and all these kinds of things, right? Um, it would be a shame to lose that thread. I feel like that John has already shown us how the process perspective can contribute to these conversations in meaningful and important ways that then, have the potential to radically change what our lives look like. Um, and as I look at the direction that things are headed in the United States right now, um, this continues to be an increasingly urgent issue, um, connected actually to the rise of authoritarianism and political instability, another one of these major existential threats. We we just can't ignore that. We can't shy away from that. We can't try to find some sort of neutral, value-free ground, which John would say, no, no, there is no such thing as value free, right? When you no longer reflect on values, you sort of just presuppose the dominant value, which in our cultural context is money. We don't want that. So we need to think creatively about the threat of misinformation, corruption, rising nationalism, and authoritarian regimes, which are undermining the nature of democracy and freedom and the well-being of people on the planet. John was also somebody who thought and worked on issues of nuclear threats and global conflicts, and particularly in creating the Living Earth movement. In his final years, was really committed to U.S.-China relations and trying to build bridges there. And I think what we have seen even more recently is where governments may be unable to adequately let me rephrase it. Citizen diplomacy will be key. It's regular people connecting and building bridges that governments may be ill-equipped to do for us. And I think that's something that with our robust network in China, and the creation of the China Project of the Center for Process Studies, the Institute for Postmodern Development of China, the work that Mei Junfan and Zhehe Wang have done over the last, goodness, 25, 30 years, in creating some partnerships with nearly 40 different universities throughout China, as well as with nonprofits and eco-villages and others. We could play a really important role as a community in strengthening those sort of those important relationships between nations and cultures. Another existential threat listed by ChatGPT, ironically, technological disruption and AI ethics. This is kind of a newer thing, I think, for our community, but it's something that we definitely are increasingly seeing as something we need to speak to, something we need to address, because AI and automation are reshaping economies and our societies. It's creating job displacement, and And it's raising all sorts of ethical concerns around privacy, bias, security, information and misinformation, and different sort of feedback loops that, again, are undermining democracy and undermining the ability to sort of empower people to use their agency for their own well-being and those of their community. Overpopulation and urbanization challenges. It's actually another thing that John has talked about in the past. So just what are we going to do about that, right? Infinite growth on a finite planet is problematic. So I think the process community is part of a sort of collection of communities, you might say, conversations, such as the systems thinking work, the work that the Club of Rome has done, the work that Donella Meadows and others through MIT had done on limits to growth. I mean, work that's been done over the last 50 years that's very much in line with the kind of work that we do, but maybe not directly people that we've been in conversation with as regularly as we should be. So I think there's really important and interesting opportunities for collaboration with allies who share some of our concerns, and to find ways to collaborate and partner would be important. Public health crises and future pandemics. So, what have we learned from COVID-19? Expose weaknesses in our global health system, and future pandemics remain a risk. So, can our process community speak to issues of public health, and issues like that? And then the last one on my list was the crisis of meaning and the mental health, spiritual epidemic. I think here we're looking at the rising loneliness and depression, anxiety, a deep sense of despair, a loss of meaning and purposelessness. I think, what can our process community say to people that can help them find a robust sense of purpose and meaning and value? And actually, I think we could say a lot. And I think our emphasis on our particular brand of spiritualities, plural, and our our set of values and commitments, particularly about freedom and interconnection and all those sorts of things, have a lot to say that could really empower people to reclaim meaning and value and purpose in their lives. So even if we sort of dealt with the problems in the world around us, what about the world within us, right? And the worlds between us. So again, that just has to be the kind of stuff that our process community engages with. At least that's my hope. So then in all of that, I'm like, okay, so great, Andrew, you've just identified the world's most pressing problems and then said now our process community has to fix them. Good luck with that. Like, what do you expect us to do, right? Well, it's not quite like that, right? I'm not thinking that we're just going to save the world, although that might be what John Cobb's called us to. But I do think that there's things that we can, things that we have to contribute to the conversation. The kinds of things that come to my mind immediately are the kinds of things that Philip already mentioned. We have I say unique, but I don't mean in a sort of I don't know, like some like absolutist kind of way, a unique perspective, a holistic perspective. There's other groups that share our intuitions, which is actually what makes our perspective useful. We're not completely alone, right? But we can help to bridge scientific, aesthetic, religious, and environmental insights and bring them all together. And I think one of the things, so our perspective, I think, is a helpful contribution, but also we have a history of bringing people together, bringing together leaders and thinkers and innovators for really cool conversations and collaborations. So I think my hope is that we can continue to do those things, and make sure that the conversations that we are facilitating are conversations about the things that matter most, and that we just don't get ourselves, I think, what is the concern of confusing being busy with being productive? It'd be really easy for us to be super active doing things because we love to have conversations and conferences and publications, and that's just what we do, and lose sight of why we do what we do. And I think when I imagine sort of John Cobb's call for us and our legacy to sort of move this movement forward, we have to keep our sort of to keep the why in mind. Why do we exist? Why do we do what we do? Why does any of it matter? And I hope that in doing so, we will continue to be relevant, and to do what we were really created to do, which is to promote the common good. So that's my 2 cents. Those are my thoughts. I look forward to hearing what all you think and having conversation about it.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was worth a lot more than 2 cents. Appreciate. And now you've really kind of set it up for Thandeka, which will flow right out of what you've been saying. Thandeka.
Thank you for the invitation to talk about process legacies and futures for a transformed world. The title of my presentation is The Process Success Story and the Elephant in the Room. Let's begin with our success story. Process study has achieved its initial aim: international standing and recognition as a global philosophy of organism, a philosophy of emotions, as John Cobb Jr. would say, spanning every continent on the planet. As a consequence, process studies is no longer on the fringe of contemporary thought, but now helps define its character and chart its course. So what's next for us? John identified the challenge we now face during the Living Earth Movement meeting on May 9th, 2024, when he asked the question, how to get ideas acted upon. How to get ideas acted upon. His answer was pure John to the core. He was honest and simply said, I don't know. Consider what Helena Norberg Hodge and Anja Lindbeck acknowledged during their Cobb Institute presentation. One of the most dangerous and least acknowledged dimensions of the global economy, they said, is something people should be aware of, but most of us aren't. The emotional fallout. The emotional fallout. The emotional fallout from the structural economic injustices and resulting environmental and social crises. It is not only disastrous, they concluded, but it's getting worse. This is the elephant in the room. It's the emotional devastation we talk about, but do not attend to in ways that, as of yet, transform feelings into an ever-expanding grassroots initiative. Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy was thus right when noting in the New York Times August 19th, 2024 feature article on him, he said, Donald Trump and the movement around him have tapped into a sense of deep alienation and national malaise. Democrats often have trouble even acknowledging those real feelings. The failure to actually feel those feelings and transform them is the elephant in the room. Senator Murphy called America's disconnection a metaphysical problem and a vast spiritual crisis. A metaphysical problem, a spiritual crisis. These two concerns are core to a process movement. Clearly, it's time for us to address the elephant in the room. John noted in correspondence, he knew where to look for that elephant. He called its hiding place the chasm between the human brain and conscious human perception. which he acknowledged process work needs new tools to explore. He never stopped searching for those new tools, and he encouraged me to look for them as well. I spent 2 decades studying the brain science of emotions and had the great fortune to have as a conversation partner for more than a decade the founder of affective neuroscience, Jaak Panksepp. Using insights from this work, I founded Contemporary Affect Theology, which studies how the emotions of our survival instincts, the emotions devastated by the structural, economic injustices and resulting environmental and social crises, how these emotions get transformed by the life-affirming feelings of interconnection. For the last decade, I've experimented with contemporary affect theology in small groups and discovered that when we create safe spaces to share our feelings, emotions are transformed. The transition is informed by compassionate understanding and trust. I created Universal Connection small group workshops for this purpose. Participants find and affirm their innermost feelings of connections to themselves, to others, and to the interconnectedness of the universe through reflection and meaningful dialogue, using a practice we call PDR&S, pausing, discerning, reflecting, and sharing their reflections in a small group, gaining ever more courage and confidence in their whole being and deepening their consciousness of interconnection. This interconnection consciousness can bind us together into a network empowered by an inspired humanity, moving us and our nation ever forward. But how do you get an overwhelmed and distracted populace to make space and time for this interconnection work? You inspire them by demonstrating this beauty. We YouTube it. My team and I want to offer universal connections to the world via authentic, ethically sound, paradigm-shifting, compassionate reality TV programming. We have a rough pilot season on YouTube already. Ideally, the participants are persons with markedly different religious and partisan views who gain compassionate understanding and by the end of the series can discern common goals and plan work together to achieve them. This is the state of the nation. People are lonely, concerned for the world, and feel powerless. Meanwhile, our divides continue to expand. Our kids' anxiety is increasing, and people are searching for a new spiritual home. As the dogma and exclusivity of current religions feel obsolete in a world that has changed so much and has become so aware of other cultures. Universal connections reveal what we've been studying and they've been thinking and feeling, but didn't know it. All humans are inextricably interconnected with all of life and have an innate capacity to experience our interconnectedness. And such feelings are indeed the natal hour of everything living in religion. It's process packaged for the rest of humanity. Most people just want to be heard and seen, connected with others, and feel like their life has purpose. That's what Universal Connections is designed to do. Speaking of purpose, the elephant of emotional devastation is also in the rooms of eco and social justice organizations. A common problem for activists is that their feelings are not adequately attended to, just their ideas and behavior. What can we do? How do we get them to make time for universal connections? I imagine an eco-civilization collective weekend conference. Invitations would be sent to the leaders of organizations who have presented their eco-civilization efforts at the Cobb Institute or at the Center for Process Studies as an event. Each leader would be encouraged to have 4 to 8 representatives attend the conference. The weekend conference would introduce the participants to an intensive Universal Connections workshop protocol, during which the breakout room exercises would be undertaken within their own respective organizations' groups. Later in the conference, connections among the organizations would be made in breakout rooms consisting of the leaders of each organization. The other breakout rooms would consist of 1 participant from each organization, again practicing Universal Connections protocols. Universal Connections can strengthen and sustain the work of the respective organizations and also network them into a global initiative of small groups interconnected for coordinated power and impact. We hope the YouTube series will encourage the audience to sign up for Universal Connections workshops. Subsequently, we could host live online events to network the Universal Connections small groups and inspire collective, ecologically based actions with presentations from the eco-civ organizations. Can these kinds of programs help create a process mass movement transforming the world? I believe so.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. The 3 of you have laid forth a picture, an analysis, and a challenge. I'm going to stir a question then while all of you are thinking. We had a lively conversation in the chat about activism and thought, especially the relationship between the two, and the issue that William Myers raises, that sometimes people are activists, but others are not even aware of the thought undergirding the activism. Our people are working on the thought and not engaging in activism. I wonder if the 3 panelists have a comment on the important role of activism and thought.
I'd love to speak to that, Mary Elizabeth. If I could jump in quick. I really appreciate Myers putting that into the chat, and you have all probably seen it happening. I find that, for example, evangelical Christians are very good at saying exactly why they do the actions that they do. I don't agree with their reasons, but the action and the reason become part of a single organic whole. Liberal Christians have been not as strong by and large at doing that. And we in Process today are often not as strong. I think of a talk I've often mentioned. John Cobb spoke to I mentioned it earlier, to the UCC annual convention, and said, I believe that our calling as Christians is to save the world. And you could almost hear an intake, a gasp, like what this is not the Cobb we expected, and then proceeded to say exactly why a process relational worldview leads us to take actions to save the world, and he meant in an environmental sense, and all creatures and all persons as well. That integral connection between thought and action, I would say, would be crucial to our success in the coming dozen years.
Thank you. Thandeka.
I believe the elephant in the room in the question is the and. The and. Activism and thought. What the F is and? It's the transition. And what's in that transition? The whole, an actual occasion of experience concressing, which, as Whitehead said, if you try to divide it up, then you have Zeno's paradox, because it's the whole experience of feeling a moment, a duration of your life, which is emotional. The elephant in the room is the inattention we pay to the transition because we think of it only as a symbolic enterprise. Whitehead and John Cobb said, no. But the social gospel movement coming out of the 19th century said, oh, we're going to set emotions aside and work on the institutions that create the emotional harm and distress. So the social gospel movement focused on the institutional challenges, leaving behind and unattended the trauma created by these institutions. But the emotions weren't left behind by the fundamentalists, by the conservatives. And so their movements grow while ours die. And its latest growth is through Donald Trump, who knows how to transform fear and rage into feelings of assurance and hope. Until we pay attention to what's foundational to the process movement, which is a datum of experience, of feelings, all we can do is conceptualize the context that creates the feeling as original without in any way actually feeling it. So the elephant in the room is the link between these two questions, activism and thought, which is a feeling concressing, not figuratively or symbolically, but literally. And we don't do emotions very well.
Thandeka, I might even take it a step further and say it's not just the link between activism and thought that's the elephant in the room. It's the elimination of and that needs to happen. It's not as if thought and action are separate things.
Which is why
that's a Descartesian, right?
Right. I totally
right.
Which is why I call it the elephant in the room. But we think of it as liberals and progressives as a symbolic transition, which for me violates Whitehead's fundamental claim that this is the real thing. The rest is the fallacy of misplaced concreteness if you aren't analyzing what is compressing, which is a duration of experience.
So it may be that we're better off no longer thinking of thought and action as separate categories that somehow need to relate to each other. Which one comes first, right? But that's thinking, acting, or we might just call it living or experiencing,
yes,
right?
With Whitehead, he created a metaphysics of emotion, a philosophy of emotion, a philosophy of organism, because he said you have to have the categories to explain the experience. The categories explain the context of the experience that emerges, that doesn't duplicate the past, but carries it on into a new level. So metaphysics pertains to analysis of the categories necessary to create that past, which creates the novelty. But he said, if you are not referring back to the actual experience of feeling connected, then it's not process thought.
I can't resist diving in here. You folks make my heart sing, because I knew when I asked the question that when I said thought and activism, that is false. And yet that is the cultural and even historically intellectual way of describing a relationship. And the three of you are diving way beneath that question to a kind of reality of experience that is extraordinarily important. And one that I'm not sure John completely understood either, because he always used the word applying thought to
Which is
activism.
which is why in our weekly conversations, John repeatedly said to me, what I'm doing now is the next stage of process thought as a lived emotional experience. And he applauded and he applauded. And as you know, Mary Elizabeth, all I did in my last book, Love Beyond Belief, which was a 2,000-year history of the loss of emotions and how they're handled, for which John wrote the preface, his last sentence in the opening paragraph, because the only assumption I made was that all the people I'm studying, Augustine, Luther, Paul, Gentiles, Jews, they all had brains. That's the only assumption I made. And thus, their brains operated in certain pre-programmed ways, even though they're trolled to their narratives and the rest. And so I discovered in this way the history of anti-Semitism as a linguistic accident, which led, well, anyway, John Cobb said in the last sentence of his opening preface, he says, because of my work, he will never be able to think of Christian theology in the same way again. And David Boyarin said, from now on, anyone who wants to understand Paul has to read Thandeka's book, which is really quite amazing, because I did a linguistic analysis of Greek and Hebrew, neither language of which I know, but using one assumption, which is, let's look at what their brains were doing from Paul's perspective to get Gentiles to feel internally like Jews. How do you get people to change the way in which they feel and explain and handle their emotions? And Paul made a tragic linguistic error, which resulted in the foundation of 2,000 years of anti-Semitism in the Christian West.
Thank you all.